So our first speaker is Mark Smith from over in political science. He is a full professor there and also an adjunct professor in comparative religion. He's been here since 1997. He has his PhD from University of Minnesota. And he, just a couple of years ago, published a book, Secular Faith, How Culture Has Trumped Religion in American Politics. The title now, different meaning.
It should get a different title.
That won a number of awards. And so today, this is a slide deck that he's going to really be engaging with us as an audience, as I understand. But you can see his title, How Intellectual Dishonesty Has Improved Christianity and Islam. So he's going to speak. We'll do a Q&A with him. He has to run off to go teach. So if you have a question, absolutely be sure to ask. And then we'll move on to Lauren and then Andrés. So, be ready to change your train of thought often. So with that, let's first welcome Mark Smith.
All right, thanks to all of you for coming. Since we got a late start, I think I'm probably down now to 10 to 15 minutes. Okay. I'm working on a book. The title of the book is working title, of course, Knowing Right from Wrong, Why Revelation Fails and Reason Succeeds. Might change somewhere along the lines, but I'm doing a lot of things in that, most of which I can't cover in 10 to 15 minutes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to carve out, one little piece, hopefully be able to do it reasonably convincing in the time we have. For part of the book, I'm using this concept of intellectual dishonesty, which I'm distinguishing from ordinary dishonesty. So ordinary dishonesty, you say something, it's not true. You can lie by omission or commission. Those would both be forms of dishonesty. Intellectual dishonesty is a different matter. With intellectual dishonesty, you're not deceiving other people, at least not intentionally. You're really deceiving yourself. And by deceiving yourself, later on you might deceive other people, but that's only incidental. And this typically comes through violating standards of rational inquiry. So these are here I'm dealing with things like confirmation bias and motivated reasoning, and you start using biases and fallacies. You throw out red herrings, and you cherry pick evidence, and you do all kinds of things that we teach students in social sciences not to do. But a lot of people just do those without even thinking about it. And these are processes that are so automatic that people don't really realize that they're doing it. And so that's why it's intellectual dishonesty. Like you should see that you really need to evaluate all the evidence, not pick out your one little piece that happens to support your point. But that's what people will tend to do. And I claim this is you're especially vulnerable to do this if your starting point is faith. Because if you have a faith commitment, almost by definition, it's not something that's rationally defended. But then once you begin there, you often then need to explain the reasons for it to someone else. And that's the point at which intellectual dishonesty can enter in. Because normally you won't say well, it's just a matter of faith, so you just have to take it on faith. People will typically give more than that. And where I want to engage that today is linking this up to religious texts, particularly in Christianity and Islam, the two largest religions in the world. That's why I'm focusing on them, not to mention that the Christian one is the one that I know best and spend the most time on, but I want to extend it to Islam as well. And where intellectual dishonesty comes in here is in interpreting texts. And so I have an approach to interpretation, and I'll just give a kind of a quick summary of that here. I certainly don't think texts speak for themselves. When you're dealing with ancient texts written in another language, ideally you're reading them in the original language and you're understanding the historical context of the times and the particularities of the writers and literary forms and genre and all that. Of course that's true. And even if you do that responsibly, you won't necessarily arrive at one single interpretation, accept that fully as well. However, when you go down that road, there's always a temptation for intellectual dishonesty, because if there's something in your scriptures that makes you go you're going to probably want to find some way to get rid of it, because if you really are treating it as revelation, not everyone treats it as revelation, but I'm really dealing here with people who do treat it as revelation. If it really comes from God, and it says, something that makes God look really bad, you're going to say, well, it must not mean that. You're interpreting it wrong. And so the possibility for intellectual dishonesty is essentially endless. Where you can say the text means actually the exact opposite of what it says. And people will do that. So a lot of what I'm dealing with here is engaging with people that are known as, quote, apologists. It's a technical term in religious communities, meaning someone who is offering a reasoned defense of their faith. But they don't say, well, I believe this because of faith. They start with faith, but then they articulate reasons. And once you start articulating reasons, then you become an apologist. So I'm dealing mostly with them. And I want to come up with some standard through which I can say, if you do this, you are really you're not playing fairly. You're not playing by the rules. So I'm not going to claim that I have like the one unique interpretation, but I do want to lay out some ground rules by which we can at least say certain interpretations are fair and reasonable. Others, somebody's just making up to try to salvage the text. And the criteria that I'm going to use is centuries of history. So if you have, in the case of Christianity, say 16, 17 centuries before the Enlightenment, or in Islam before the 20th century, say 13 centuries, if you have a continuous line of interpretation where everybody agreed, this is what the text said, this is what it meant, and then conveniently, after the rise of feminism or after the rise of human rights values and all kinds of other modern ideas, if at that point people go back and say, well, this is what the text meant all along, that's what it meant back in the 7th century, even though nobody knew that's what it meant in the 7th century, I'm going to claim that's intellectual dishonesty. So I'm going to give you an example of this. This is a line from the Quran, 434. So this is commonly known as the wife-beating verse. So it says men are in authority over women. And by the way, this particular translation is from a religious studies scholar named Aisha Chaudhry. Other translations are similar. Because God has preferred some over others, and because they spend of their wealth, righteous women are obedient and guard in their husband's absence what God would have them guard. Now we get to the wife-beating part. Concerning those women from whom you fear nushuz, or disobedience, rebellion, admonish them, and or abandon them in bed, second step, and or brana, hit them. Again, her translation, other translations will say strike them, but some sort of indication of a physical force. If they obey you, do not seek a means against them. So in other words, if they obey you, then you don't have to do these things. But if they're disobedient to the husband, this is the things you do. You admonish them, abandon them in bed, and or hit them. God is most high. Great. So what Chaudhry does in her book is she shows that until the 20th century, every single interpreter agreed that text indicated that husbands could physically hit their wives. There was some additional analysis and some disagreement about, how many lashes, 30 lashes, 100 lashes, can you make her bleed, etc. But as far as the basic principle of that domestic violence was in fact divinely authorized, everybody agreed upon that. And what she does is she takes a postmodern approach to texts, and she says, well, it's just words. It doesn't mean anything. It means whatever you want it to mean. And the meaning comes from the community, not from the text itself. So if the community reads this and says, no, that doesn't mean strike, that doesn't mean hit, that means something else, and then modern alternatives are, don't strike her, what that actually means is travel, go away. Or some people say what that actually means have sex with her. So there are a variety of these clever, creative, modern interpretations that I'm calling intellectually dishonest because nobody thought that that's what the text meant. And if you really read it in historical context, would it surprise you that not only in Arabia, but you get the same, China, Europe, like wherever you go in the 7th century, there probably would have been an expectation that, the wife is under the husband's thumb, and if he has to, knock her around a little bit, then so be it. So I'm saying this is a modern reading of the text that I'm going to call intellectually dishonest because it violates the tradition. It violates 13 centuries of continuous interpretation. And it's essentially made up to get around a modern problem. And I'm doing more in the book than just that, but I think I'll stop there just to give you one piece that we can hopefully grapple with. So to welcome your questions or comments.
So what would be
Sure.
the intellectually honest way of interpreting this in today's society? Will it be saying that's what people used to believe before, we should discard the whole text and start from scratch, or I don't know, like make amendments?
Right. Well, it's tricky as far as whether you're inside the tradition or outside the tradition. So if you're outside the tradition, you can say, all right, maybe Muhammad's had some interesting things to say. Maybe he had some flaws indicating who he was and the time and the context. Just the same thing you would say about Plato or Homer or Shakespeare or Confucius or whoever. They don't have the final say on any matters. And since they've sort of stood the test of time and attracted attention, we probably ought to give it some initial respect, but we don't automatically defer to them and say whatever they said is quote, true in any grand sense. That's if you're outside the tradition. If you're inside the tradition, once you say it's revelation, that's not really an option for you. You have to say, well, this is from God. If this is from God, you can't say like, well, God made a mistake. And in the case of Islam, it's not only inspired by God, but it's God's actual words, in God's language. So there's really no way around this problem, I think, if you're inside the tradition, which is why I end up saying that's why we need a secular morality that just sets this aside and might use it as a resource, but doesn't, say that it has the last word on any topic. The tricky part is what do you do if you're inside the tradition? And some people will, some alternatives are to be like a cultural Christian or Muslim. A lot of people do that. They maintain, most people, their religion is essentially an accident of birth. And a lot of people will maintain it, even though they have no idea what the texts actually say. They don't read them, they don't engage with them. It's just something you're born with and you hang on to it. So that's another way to handle it. Or you can try to do something like what Aisha Chandri does and just say, well, text it's inert. Doesn't mean anything. It means whatever the community says it means. I can't go there myself because I think that's a dishonest approach to like get around the actual problem, but that's another way to handle it. Sure, go ahead.
I guess I have a couple questions. I am curious about when tradition starts. Like when does that clock start? So for example, throw out the St. James Bible because that obviously changed translation quite a bit, but that's traditional now. So do we accept those translation at this point?
You mean Jerome or St. James Bible? The Latin Vulgate, the Jerome's.
No, St. James, like the one that was accepted in the UK, like the Anglican.
Oh, King James. Okay, okay, King James. Yeah,
King James,
right.
I apologize. Like that obviously has different translations, etc.
Yep.
And you also have like the Jewish tradition, which uses
Sure.
the Talmud, where they like debate what is meant by all of these different words, because there's an understanding that words can mean different things to different people, and there are different translations and different understandings of various things. And so, yeah, where does tradition start?
I would say ideally as soon as it's written, but of course we often don't have writers from the same, period. So in the case of, like the Talmud, they're dealing with texts that by that point are already a few hundred years old. I mean, some of them more, and varying. In the case of the Christian tradition, you get people like Tertullian or Augustine that are coming along, and Tertullian is at least 50 years prior to any of the texts, and maybe 100 or so years past some of them. Augustine is much later than that even. So ideally, we go as early as possible, but we're not going to get all the way back just because the records aren't there. And so when I say
interpretations from what they supposedly heard, directly or indirectly, right? Like you've got like the 5 authors and then the redactor and sorry, I went to a Christian school.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so you have a text at that point that they're engaging with, and those texts in turn, are you referring to the JD, like the Hebrew Bible, like the four authors? I mean, that is itself a modern construction. So that's not something that say the Talmud authors were dealing with, but they certainly were engaging the texts, and there's some textual variance, right? So what we treat as, say, Isaiah today wasn't necessarily settled at that point. So that's another complication. So I would accept all of these things. In general, I want earlier is better, and I'm looking for continuity. And in the case of this verse, you do have continuity. I mean, that's what Chaudhry shows in her book. She's working in Arabic, Urdu, and then in the modern period, English. So Arabic and Urdu, 2 of the most prominent languages that Quranic interpretation was handled in. And she shows from the beginning, that's what everybody accepted, that this allowed wife beating. What she says is, well, that's because the interpreters were all men in a patriarchal society, and so of course they read it that way. And she's right in one respect, but she rules out the possibility that Muhammad is in a patriarchal society, and that when he's hearing God's voice, he's probably going to hear a voice that says, oh yeah, it's okay to beat your wife. So she rules out that possibility. So like, you have to preserve Muhammad as perfect. But then as soon as Muhammad dies, everyone else for 1,300 years is getting it wrong until the modern interpreters come along. And that's the part at which I can't go there. Like, I'm just going to say, no, Muhammad was a man of his times, and the voice he was hearing from God, he thought that voice said, husbands can beat their wives.
Can you
Go
just a little bit situate this? So the scholar that you're talking about did this translation?
Yes.
And you're identifying her as a postmodernist. And can you situate her a little bit? So her perspective is that she's wanting to defend a Revelation reading by saying what? That the text is whatever we make it?
Yeah, she's...
but she's trying to defend the sanctity of the text, and she's not wanting to suggest it's open to interpretation?
She's wanting to suggest it's open to interpretation, and she's wanting to reinterpret it in areas like this where it says something that you don't like. So if it says something you don't like, well, come up with a new interpretation, get the rest of your community to go along with it. And if everybody else in your community goes along with the new interpretation, well, that's what the text means. Because the text inherently is nothing. It's inert. And if the community decides that this text doesn't mean hit your wife, it means travel away from your wife, well, then that's what it means.
So, okay. So she would not be open to an interpretation that approached this as a symptom of its times, of a historical artifact that may still have pedagogical value, right? But so she's down with it. She's wanting to defend a Revelation read through a postmodern lens.
Right.
I'm just struggling to like, what is her discipline?
Religious studies. And she's also wanting to stay within the religion, right? So she could leave the religion and say, I'm not a Muslim, but she's wanting to say, no, I am a Muslim, and what we need to do is to treat this text as malleable.
But it's not so black and white, right? I mean, there's all kinds of opportunities from within Islam or from within Christianity to interpret these texts in ways that are both compatible with one's contemporary moral worldview, but also honoring the spirit of the text. But you're saying that no longer is a commitment to revelation.
I'd say I'm with you to a point. I think that the texts do have some internal contradictions, and if you want to emphasize this part and de-emphasize that part, or find some resources in there, I think that's certainly possible. But if you do that far enough, you eventually reach a point where I'm going to call it intellectually dishonest. So if you want to take the text,
the prodigal son, and saying or many stories from the Bible. I know the
Right.
Bible better than I'm sorry, but and saying, okay, sure, maybe this person didn't live to 800 years, or right, you can sort of say, but there's a valuable moral lesson in this story, right? I mean, is there not room for that? Or again, I'm just wondering, like, what is the spectrum? It's like revelation, pure, taking the text in some sort of unadulterated way. Versus, I mean, I'm just wondering kind of where you're falling in terms of what becomes intellectually dishonest.
Right. Well,
I don't know if I'm articulate.
I just had something, because I'm grappling. I guess what my question is, too, to go along with this is like, what's the role of the intellectual and how is the intellectual being framed? Is it specifically within religious institutions, or is it outside of religious institutions? Is it void or of like political influence, economic influence, all these other influences? So is this text specifically saying within religion and assuming that religion itself is separate from all these other influences? And what's the role of like the intellectual in its interpretation, I guess?
yeah, no, those are both great questions. So in terms of things like the parables and the prodigal son, I would say that parables inherently have more interpretive possibilities, precisely because it's a story. But this isn't a story. This is a command. Same thing, and there are lots of commands in the Bible as well. Slaves, obey your master. You know, where's the parable there? That's just a command that takes slavery for granted. And in the Old Testament, it says you can purchase foreigners and make them slaves and pass them on to your descendants. That's chattel slavery. So that's explicitly authorized in Christianity. And that's not through some parable. That's through direct commands. And for 17 centuries, everybody within Christianity agreed that the Bible allowed slavery. There were some Christians who rose up to oppose it, but they never claimed that the Bible opposed it. They might claim God opposed it, and they would try to figure out some theological argument against it, but not that the Bible opposed slavery. That didn't come around until after 1700. So I would say when we're dealing with stories, there's a more interpretive license. But when it's a direct command, I think that shrinks the possibilities. And there's a point at which when the text says, slaves obey your masters, and someone comes along and says, well, what that really means is that slavery is immoral, I'm going to say, no, that's intellectually dishonest. When someone comes along and says, what this means is travel away from your wife, when no one thought it meant that for 1,300 years, I'm going to say that's intellectually dishonest too. So I accept your points that that there are a range of interpretive possibilities, and there are competing resources within the tradition, and sometimes there are contradictions, and you have to resolve them. And in the process of resolving them, that might point you in a new direction. I'm down with all that, but up to a point. Some people will push that so far that you basically get to postmodernism, and like, well, it means whatever you want it to mean. And if you want to say the text means the moon is made of green cheese, then sure, that's what it means to you. And I'm going to cut it off before we get there. And then to your point about the role of intellectuals, and it's tricky because sometimes they're working inside the tradition, say teaching in a seminary. If you're teaching in a seminary, your options are more constrained. If you're outside of teaching in a seminary, that's a different story. And you do get people coming along, whether it's Jonathan Edwards or Martin Luther or whoever, who I think we could call intellectuals, in that they are doing deep analysis, and they're often doing some innovation as well. And so I would count them as part of the tradition. And in the case of, say, slavery in the Bible, Martin Luther had no problem with saying, he didn't try to claim the Bible opposed slavery. That comes a couple hundred years after Luther. Sure, go ahead.
I just want to say thank you for coming. I'm sorry I forgot to say that.
Okay, no.
I'm curious if this is obviously a presentation that's tailored towards Christianity and Islam, but do you use this concept of intellectual dishonesty, I'm really sorry if I missed this, towards any other arena? Because I'm intrigued by the concept of intellectual dishonesty as it can be applied towards other ends besides religion, for example. I mean, the first thing that my mind went to is a constructionist on the Supreme Court too, and how that debate there. And I think you could apply this in a number of different arenas. I'm just curious if you've crossed over in any other way.
Oh, I totally agree. You could apply it pretty much everywhere. And some amount of intellectual dishonesty is just another word for what it means to be a human being. Because we tend to form beliefs for all kinds of non-rational reasons. But then when asked to defend them, then we try to offer rational reasons, and often the reasons are frankly rather flimsy. And we're doing motivated reasoning. We're constructing we're constructing the reasoning to lead us to the conclusion that we had at the outset. So I think this is just a general phenomenon, and I don't claim that I'm immune to it because I'm a human being. Human beings engage in intellectual dishonesty, and that's why we have things like double-blind experiments and criteria for coding, intercoder reliability, and there are various things you can do to try to rein in this sort of infinite possibility. A lot of good scholarship tries to counter that by saying, all right, well, if you're a historian, you're dealing with a certain period, like here are the documents, and if you claim that based upon these documents they said such and such, hopefully there's someone else in your field who's also read those documents who can say, no, that's actually not what they said. I've read them, and you're totally mischaracterizing the letter from so-and-so to so-and-so. So a lot of scholarship tries to deal with the problems of intellectual dishonesty, but it's a general problem, definitely not unique to religion. All right, so that I should probably yield the floor here just in the interest of getting this all out by 4 o'clock. So.
Super. All right. Thanks, Mark.
All right.
This is Lauren Berliner, and she's an associate professor up at Bothell in the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences. She has her PhD from UC San Diego in comm. Her most recent book came out this summer, right? Or at least I went to the book launch this summer, so I assume
Yeah.
it was when it came out. And it's called Producing Queer Youth, The Paradox of Digital Media Empowerment. And it was very interesting because this book focuses on queer youth media makers and their responses to actually negotiating this project. You're not presenting on that, so you're
No,
presenting.
this is
Okay.
very helpful, thank you.
Okay. So I'm like, I know, I'm assuming you're presenting on your newer stuff. So the book's really interesting because these queer youth are engaged in these projects that they have to do their own grant funding, and they're working within nonprofits and how they're representing themselves. So it was a super interesting project because there was both this media element and then Lauren's research on it. So definitely, yeah, it was a super book. So, but now Lauren is working, it's a totally different topic, but in a new phase of her research that I think she's going to present on today, with some overlapping themes, of course. And yeah, so we'll again do 50 minutes, then we'll do Q&A, and then we'll go on to Andrés. So with that, welcome.
Thank
Lauren.
you. Hi, everybody. Thank you. Thanks. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here. So thank you so much for including me and inviting me. This was working with digital participatory media, chasing the tail of an ever-moving object was an aspirational title for an aspirational talk. This is, let's take it as an invitation to coffee if anyone would like to think through what it feels like or how to deal with working with media objects that shift as you're studying them. My career has been a case of trying to chase my own tail as I research not only ever-changing media platforms, but policies and discourses around them. So as Katie mentioned, this was the book. I'm just going to talk you quickly through some of my major projects. So since I haven't met some of you before, just to give you a lay of the land. And then I'm going to do a more formal talk regarding my more recent research that I actually started in 2013, but I've been doing along the time I've been doing this. So this is my book, Producing Queer Youth. Came out in July, and I'm specifically looking at the ways in which queer youth are utilizing media production along lines that have been encouraged through particular templates within media platforms, and then against that as well, to launch a critique of digital media empowerment that it's often used when discussing disempowered people or marginal people at the margins. This is another book that came out this summer that I co-edited with another COM affiliate, Ron Crable. You'll see one of the chapters has your very own Carmen Gonzalez, has a chapter, a wonderful chapter about her work teaching here. And this is Feminist Interventions in Participatory Media, Pedagogy, Publics, and Practice. And actually, if you look down the list, you'll probably recognize a number of names because we sought for connections across our networks at UW, including the iSchool, and Kathy Woodward from the Simpson Center, and then Monica Schengle-Jones, who also was a visiting scholar here, and thought about our connections within practice and pedagogy. So we were able to frame that in the book. I also am a co-curator of the Festival of Inappropriation, which is a festival of appropriated media works and short films under 20 minutes. This is an image of the one time Northwest Film Forum put us on the marquee, but we are there every year, and I'm really happy to do guest lectures and course-related work with your students if you want to engage with this. So all of these are openings to broader conversations, but in general, I just wanted to introduce you to some of my key animating questions with all of my work. So in all the projects that I've worked on and continue to work on, I'm interested in how people at the margins engage with participatory media forms and how we're defining the margins changes per research topic that I'm working on. I'm interested in where and how does this media circulate and how are production processes and their impacts mediated by social, economic, and technological structures. And what does it mean to have meaningful engagement in a time of ubiquitous media? So I'm going to now do the formal, I'm going to jump into formal mode. This is actually from a talk I gave at Society for Cinema and Media Studies, CMS, on a panel called Memes Against Humanity. This talk is called Spreading Cancer. I'm going to start my timer. If I need to cut off due to time, just cut me off, but I think we'll be okay. Why do I support universal health care paid for by our taxes? Asked a recent progressive political meme that circulated in August 2016. Because I don't want to live in a country where people have to set up a GoFundMe page just so they don't die. This meme reflects a remarkable emerging phenomenon within US healthcare. The use of charitable crowdfunding sites such as GoFundMe to address financial burdens arising from illnesses, disabilities, and accidents, crises exacerbated by unfilled gaps in the social safety net. Increasingly, that is not the slide that was supposed to come up, but it is useful. Increasingly, Americans are using crowdfunding strategies to draw attention to their illness stories in order to solicit support in the form of donations and shares on social media and to ameliorate the extraordinary costs of uncovered or poorly covered health care. The political, social, and health consequences of austerity, along with the fallout from the 2008 financial collapse and the shortcomings of the Affordable Care Act, are made evident in websites like GoFundMe. As competition increases among campaigns, patients and their loved ones are obliged to produce compelling and sophisticated appeals. Crowdfunding has rapidly become institutionalized as part of the healthcare financing landscape. Medical institutions such as hospitals counsel patients to set up campaigns, and starting campaigns for friends and family members has become a popular form of caregiving. GoFundMe, a for-profit company founded in 2010, raised over $470 million in campaigns by 2014. By 2016, yearly fundraising exceeded $2 billion. Medical and health campaigns consistently comprise GoFundMe's most popular funding category, claiming 17% of total donations. In 2012, and it's only increased exponentially since. By 2015, GoFundMe had hosted more than 1.8 million campaigns for medical causes. This is a talk about memes. That's why you're seeing these things. This talk emerges out of a long-term study I'm engaged with my colleague Nora Kenworthy, who's also at UW-Bothell, Nursing and Health Studies, and she's a medical anthropologist. And we've also recently brought in Jin-Q Jung, who's a GIS, geospatial technologist, and Anjum, I am completely Hajat, who's in public health, who works on epidemiology. My paper draws on a mixed methods pilot study we conducted of 200 randomly selected Gofundme campaigns from 2016, and we studied quantitative data on the characteristics and relative successes of those campaigns, and conducted a more in-depth textual analysis of how crowdfunders construct narratives about illness and financial need and attempt to demonstrate their deservingness. And we're currently in the process of interviewing medical crowdfunders in Seattle and Dallas. When we studied the success of the campaigns, we learned that crowdfunding campaigners were just not reaching their targets. While the average campaign goal was over $12,000, the average campaign raised close to $3,000. Our most surprising finding was that only 10% of the campaigns met their campaign goals. We also found that the number of friends does not correlate with the goal or amount of money raised, and what actually really matter most in success we found is spreadability, which is based on how compelling a campaign is. To make a campaign compelling, or to set one up in the first place, one must possess a set of unique social media literacies in addition to existing reading and writing literacies. Successful crowdfunding requires that campaigners master medical and media literacies. As such, we argue that crowdfunding has the potential to deepen social and health inequities in the U.S. by promoting forms of individualized charity that rely on unequally distributed literacies to demonstrate deservingness and worth. Crowdfunding narratives also distract from crisis of healthcare funding and gaping holes in the social safety net by encouraging hyper-individualized accounts of suffering on media platforms, where precarity is portrayed as the result of inadequate self-marketing, rather than the inevitable consequences of structural conditions of austerity. So spreadability is crucial for campaign success. To borrow a phrase I heard from media scholar Alex Uhas and an SEMS panel in Atlanta, if it doesn't spread, you're dead, which is a play on the phrase, if it doesn't spread, it's dead, to think about spreadable media. And as we know from Jenkins, Ford, and Green and what they've taught us about spreadability, simple, memorable media are most likely to spread. And if there's a more efficient form of spreadable, and is there a more efficient form of spreadable media than memes? Memes are a valuable tool in helping campaigners leverage social media vernacular forms towards increased legibility of their medical narratives and to quickly consolidate information about their need and call to action. We found that campaigns are more successful when needs are presented as discrete, simple, and solvable. While medical crowdfunding campaigners are not making or rehashing memes in exactly the same ways that other kinds of campaigns that you may have seen have, many campaigners are borrowing from the logics of memes to articulate very complex needs and indicate a desire for campaign circulation. Research has shown that social networks have value in building identity, community, and culture. But accessing and mobilizing the value of networks requires specific capabilities, including adept self-expression and a familiarity with multiple forms of literacy. Because contemporary sociality in the digital age is organized by network connectedness that favors weak and latent ties, campaigners must work to appeal to their imagined audiences. As with other forms of social media, Gofundme is a platform that acts as technology of the self, in which users engage in both what Van Dyke calls unconscious self-expression and, quote, conscious self-promotion. Social media literacies are also critical to ensuring campaign success and establishing deservingness. Those who are social media literate know that storytelling and narrative self-presentation through both text and images helps to ensure the spreadability of their campaigns, inspiring viewers to pass them on to their personal networks. Additionally, strong reading and writing literacies act as important markers of social capital, as the technical literacies that are needed to take full advantage of GoFundMe's resources and link to the various social media sites that can help to promote campaigns. Campaigners must also possess medical literacy in forms of patient expertise that enable them to translate complex medical information, navigate health systems, and understand insurance and billing. Each of these literacies reflect neoliberal values in which campaign success, spreadability, and even forms of care become the responsibility of individuals and their personal networks. So Thus, crowdfunding has the potential to exacerbate social and health inequities, though it's often portrayed as a meritocratic system that rewards hardworking and morally deserving campaigners. Campaigners' knowledge of how to produce successful media such as memes is bound up in that problematic. When we examine the images that many crowdfunders use to promote their medical campaigns, we find consistent patterns across images that reflect archetypal sympathetic characters. Fallen heroes in uniform, mothers posed with families, sick children hooked up to machines, and more. Increasingly, we've noticed the utilization of the language of memes enter the campaign as part of the rhetorical vernacular. Here I'm referring to memes not just in their popular comedic internet form, but I'm returning back to the origin of the term meme itself as a practice and process of cultural evolution that involves the replication of successful factors. When we see the repetition of particular types of images across campaigns, we may interpret this as simply evidence of photographic tropes of disability and illness or genres of family photography, but if we examine the photographs in conjunction with the writing that accompanies them, we start to see the artifacts of meme culture, whether it is actual utilization of internet memes or simply using the framing, hashtags, and unified themes that are common to internet memes. Here's an example. Internet memes present a language that average Americans have come to rely on for communication. We use them to express our politics, our emotions, and our concerns. At a moment when so many Americans are turning to crowdfunding for support and in doing so must produce media to demonstrate their worthiness, it should be no surprise that they're utilizing the rhetorics of memes to make their cases legible, convincing, and palatable. The pervasive pull yourself up by your bootstraps myth makes it difficult for many Americans to ask for help, particularly when it comes to financial matters. Many of the campaigns we studied had disclaimers, quote, "I wish I didn't have to do this, but it was my only option left." And we're hearing that in interviews as well. Yet by using memes, campaigners can gesture to a cultural practice of participation that inherently indexes other campaigns out there and therefore works to visually and rhetorically universalize the experience of asking for money. The form in and of itself indicates that it was designed to spread, which may alleviate some of the feelings of digital begging and present an argument for deservingness within a recognizable form. Adding humor and lightheartedness, often associated with meme culture, also distracts from the shame of asking or possible schadenfreude of witnessing. In our study, we explored 2 campaigns in depth in order to understand how dominant social mores and various media literacies shape their perceived deservingness and thus relative success. And if I have 4 minutes, I'll share this with you. Oh, this is another example. It's not the campaign we studied. Here, a few more. Okay, so this is Team Supervan campaign. The Team Supervan campaign demonstrates a mastery of crowdfunding by effectively utilizing social media and in particular memes, posting a plethora of images and creating what is essentially a unified and marketable brand. Supervan, around 6-year-old Van and his team of supporters. It's one of the top earning campaigns in our sample. Van's 17-month with stage 3 cancer is heavily documented by his mother. 20 updates containing photos and text tell the story of his diagnosis, treatment, and eventual remission. Through the initial text on the homepage and throughout the very detailed updates, contributors are encouraged to join a team in which their prayers, thoughts, and of course financial contributions make them a part of the Johnson family's journey. In its many pages, the campaign relays a human interest story that only briefly mentions financial burden. Conversely, one of the less successful campaigns in our family, feels like a family, in our sample called Family in Need, struggles to monetize. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry, it's been a long day. I taught today too. Struggles to mobilize the necessary media literacy skills for effective self-marketing. And I'm not gonna be showing the campaign because I'm using it as a negative example and do not wish to further objectify the family. It has garnered only 15 donors in 10 months despite 124 shares and has earned $550 of its $10,000 goal. Created by a self-declared husband and father of 4 sons, the campaign story describes how his family, quote, has been struggling with our bills due to chronic health issues and surgeries that were related to familial disorders and the autism diagnosis of his 2 sons. The campaign consists of just one image, a brief introduction to the situation, and a few short updates that reiterate need. These campaigns take very different approaches in how they address financial need. Team Supervan provides detailed information about the specific costs that the funds will help defer, including particular medical illness treatments, as well as trips to the hospital, parking, deductibles, co-pays, and other out-of-pocket expenses. Family in Need, on the other hand, references more generalized problems. They claim that, quote, bills have stacked up and that their home is at risk of going back into foreclosure. While the latter family's needs are arguably more acute, the lack of specificity undermines the sense that they can be effectively alleviated. The discrepancy in the demonstrations of media literacy between the two campaigns is apparent. It is clear that the Team Supervan campaigners and potential donors possess extensive media literacies, leveraging the campaign across media platforms by including a link to a robust and frequently updated Facebook page and deploying the hashtags JustBeatIt, Cancer Sucks, and Supervan. It includes several photographic memes that have legibility and, most importantly, spreadability with potential donors who use social media. For instance, one photo of a van on a stretcher in the hospital includes black typeface that reads, "No hair, don't care." Meanwhile, the Family in Need creator appears to be struggling with even the basic functionality of the site, claiming he had to set up a second campaign because he had trouble changing his bank on the first one he set up. To boot, the text is rife with spelling and grammatical errors that distract from clarity. Utilizing symbolic language and images is central to campaign marketability. Team Supervan presents itself as a unified brand, one that refers to the heroism of both the patient and his team of supporters. It includes the tagline, "Sometimes real superheroes live in the hearts of small children fighting big battles." Van is described as a super child, our hero, and as having super strength. And even is depicted as a superhero with two images of him in a cape that have been edited to seem as if he is flying. Van's team of family and friends also appear in Supervan's apparel, with one shirt reading, "Van has superpowers and can defeat anything." Van's superheroism is supported with descriptions of his optimism and strength during trials. One photo shows him smiling with the caption, even after chemo, he's all smiles." The superhero motif is powerful and popular and legible across a variety of literacies and tastes. It also plays into neoliberal dogmas regarding self-branding, independence, and the superhuman skills needed to navigate medical and economic systems, while working against potential narratives of vulnerability that would make these socioeconomic dynamics more visible. I know I'm short on time, so I'm going to skip ahead, yeah?
Go ahead. It's fine.
Okay.
Better to cut from Q&A than cut from your presentation.
All right. Whereas Team Supervan uses text and images to tell a story about specific medical tragedy motivating their campaign, the Family in Need site is very sparse, with only one dark photograph that depicts the 6 family members sitting on a couch together, with the youngest son frowning while holding a newborn baby. Besides this photo are 12 brief text updates of 2 or 3 lines. Unlike Team Supervan, where needs are described and explained across several pages of writing and accompanying images, here potential donors must work to determine a hierarchy of needs. What the updates make clear, however, is that the family is struggling and in a state of increasing desperation. As their needs and desperation mount, it becomes more difficult to identify specific needs. Rather, the campaign appears to seek some amelioration of the family's extreme financial distress. Medical crowdfunding images represent a form of self-marketing that hybridizes advertising logics and the vernacular with memes. Through meme vernaculars, individuals can engage with both their networks and the media without having to utilize professional tools or to seek out industry representation. While it's clearly problematic that individuals must create narratives to seek funds for health care in the first place, it's notable that unlike philanthropic campaigns of the pre-Web 2.0 broadcast media past, the individual does actually have some control of the message. One significant way that certain campaigns have been able to achieve their goals is when local media or national daytime programs like The Today Show or Ellen pick them up as human interest stories. This form of philanthropic appeal has a long history in broadcast media, thinking back to telethons, public service announcements, local news headlines, and even the mid-century game show Queen for a Day. But the important difference here is that when broadcast media producers integrate a crowdfunding campaign into an episode or article, they must first begin with the campaigner's own self-narrative representation in the campaign. Even if they do significantly manipulate the representation, the audience may still then go to the crowdfunding site itself, where we will encounter the campaigner's self-produced images and narrative. This democratization of philanthropic appeal may seem to suggest there's a multiplicity of narrative possibilities. Yet elsewhere, Nora Kenworthy and I have argued that the rhetorics of most successful crowdfunding campaigns are indeed formulaic and derivative of others like them. So what I wish to emphasize here is that part of the formula for campaign success involves social media vernaculars that campaigners are familiar with, which in many cases draws from meme culture. It also appears to point to campaigners' incorporation of the many human interest story tropes of broadcast media and advertising into this hybrid form. Crowdfunding meme vernaculars enable campaigners to both reproduce and manipulate the logics of broadcast philanthropy. And more as we speak to campaigners in Seattle and Dallas, we're finding that campaigns that are doing best are from individuals who are already have some sort of PR savvy, that they know to contact local news as soon as someone they know or love enters the hospital, in the case of a tragic accident or something. For successful medical crowdfunding campaigns, medical crowdfunding campaigns, we can not only learn how Americans are utilizing social media for material and emotional support, but also gain a greater understanding of the interplay between traditional broadcast and social media logics. What's more, we may obtain insight into the ways both broadcast and self-produced media are bound up in foregrounding individual needs at the expense of attending to the systemic issues that are prompting medical campaigns in the first place. I'll stop there. And these are some of the examples from Ellen, and they feature them on their site.
Great.
Yeah, I think I just ate up everyone's time. Thank you. Yeah, you just tell me when to stop.
So this is really, really interesting, and I don't know what it is. Other people do. So there's something I feel really uncomfortable about the medical crowdfunding, and there's something going on with it. But and so this was really helpful because it really helped me think through, like, why is it that I feel uncomfortable about this? So that, thank you for helping me as I'm dealing with this. So of course, there seems to be, I'm guessing, just on the examples you used, that like kids with cancer is probably going to give you this like bump up in attention. But this idea that how the story is presented, I think is sort of paradoxical, that if we assume that the unsuccessful campaign that had all these grammatical errors, didn't have a lot of like savvy about how to use the site, that some of that might signal potentially a greater need for that money, and that campaign that you showed that like they like, you know, we're doing everything right, we're very savvy about things. But I wanted to hear a little bit more about, in this demonstration of need, in the perfect campaign, how much does it matter that when I look at this campaign and I'm like, gosh, these people really need my money. And if I'm guessing if they're like too good and too well presented, I'm like, if, you know, like that maybe I don't think there is need. Like, how does that play out? That is there a relationship between like how well they're presenting their case and how much need there is?
Well, so you touched on a number of things actually, and what you're asking about. Like there are many different. There's a spectrum of the different kinds of campaigns that are out there. So. The surprising thing that we found, and I guess based on our own experiences navigating the world of crowdfunding as potential donors, and in my case, as someone who has crowdfunded before, the most tragic cases don't circulate as well as we would necessarily expect. It's not the most tragic case gets the most money. Obviously, established networks networks feed networks. So if you have 100,000 friends on Facebook, but they're all in poverty, you're not going to get that many donations. And also part of it is figuring out how to activate your network if you do have friends who have money, or you're in a network that has financial capital. In terms of the, so you're asking like if you have the best craft, like you can craft the best story in the world, but that won't necessarily help everyone, depending on.
I'm guessing. I mean, it's like it seems like that there's this linkage between how well you can like present your case, how much in need you are, and the economic well-being of that family. It's not like these things are unrelated.
Well, there's this equation that we all do when we see. I mean, I'm assuming that probably most people in the room have been sent a crowdfunding campaign before, whether it be for a medical issue or a Kickstarter for an independent film, and you have this equation a formula you do in your mind of should I give to this or not? How deserving is this campaign compared to other campaigns I've been sent in the spectrum of all the money I'm going to give to charities this year, in the spectrum of all the money I have, and concentric circles outward. So in looking at campaigns, there is this equation, and in talking to international journalists, I think it's a very American thing that we're questioning deservingness. So how deserving is this person? And there's a way in which we are understanding that this is reproducing social biases that we can't even necessarily get our heads around. Because in doing working through those equations in our minds, you can have the best, the tightest campaign in the world, but if it's a campaign for, an 80-year-old or unemployed man with lung cancer and HIV, I just threw together a whole lot of things that are hard to campaign for. You have people looking and saying, okay, well, that person is older, so they're not likely to live as long, and my return, it's a really crude way of thinking about it, but people are thinking about this in terms of return on investment. Is there a discrete solvable problem? If I donate to this person, can they have the transplant they need and live on for the rest of what would have been their natural life? That was worth it. This person has chronic illness, like lupus. I'm not going to be able to help them. I'm not sure I answered your question, just because it's a very big one. But yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that more.
I think thinking about it in terms of like this calculation, even though it's kind of not very nice to say, but that is what goes on in people's minds.
And it's not even, here we're talking about it as medical campaigns as their own category that we're just seeing, we're siphoning off. But actually when we're looking at making these decisions, we're comparing them to, there was a fire in in this town, and there's this national crisis, and then there's this other child's college education. You're looking at all these campaigns against each other too. So yeah.
Does Gofundme gather demographic data?
So GoFundMe is a total black box. I'm sure they do. We've been able to scrape quite a bit, but they did not reveal gender or race. So we've been working, and this is not my area, but my collaborators have been working on ways to get a sense of who is making these campaigns, and in particular, where are they clustering? So we actually saw more campaigns from states that did not take the Medicaid expansion under the ACA than those who did. So that was an interesting finding for us. But we're interested in seeing okay, well, how does this play out in terms of race? How does this play out in terms of age? We do know that women crowdfund way more often than men. They're the campaigners, the people starting the campaigns. And more often people campaign for others rather than campaign for themselves. It's pretty rare to find people who campaign for themselves.
How often was that child, like that one example you showed about the kidney transplant?
How often?
How often is the campaigner a child?
I don't know specific numbers. Oh, the person being campaigned for?
No, the person making.
Oh.
campaigns and
Oh, I have never seen a child campaign.
so that was just the meme that was used. The narrative was that
Yeah,
the child.
the mom.
But I wonder if sometimes, do you think it could possibly be a child?
Well, I've been surprised that a lot of the people we've been interviewing have been like 19-year-olds, or we're calling them at their college campuses, and they're campaigning for their parents or relatives because they're assumed to, and rightly so, have the social media savvy to do it. Literally, the last person I interviewed said, I didn't think I could do this because of the money aspect, because that seemed like a grown-up thing.
Yeah.
But then I realized I could make this campaign because I do stuff like this all the time.
Yeah. So I'm super curious about the creation side of it.
Yeah.
Because I think that in the work that I do,
Yeah.
families make decisions collectively, right?
Mhm.
And kids often are the proxies for a lot
Mhm.
of these health-related things. So I'm sure that there are kids that are younger than that
Yeah.
who are running these campaigns.
Oh yeah.
For their families.
And there are adults who are in their 50s, the parents of the person who's in an accident who don't have internet accounts or are undocumented and are concerned about their, making themselves visible, and are doing like spaghetti dinners or tamales, like just to do something offline. So that's been interesting too. Yeah.
I have a possibly a very basic question that sounds very stupid. Talking about the creation of these campaigns, in your talk, you obliquely referenced a number of cultural, institutional considerations that prompt the use of GoFundMe. To what extent is GoFundMe a purely American phenomenon? I mean, in the 200 cases that you examined, did you see any, or did you select for American-based campaigns?
We did. And it also differs. They're different. You only will see per country. I mean, it's like Wikipedia where you have to toggle over. It just so happens that Nora and I are the first people to have done a research study on medical crowdfunding. And there's Jeremy Snyder, who's a bioethicist in Canada as well. And so a lot of press contacted us, like starting 2 years ago. And then we found very quickly that we were hearing from international press as well, because they're so surprised at how we use crowdfunding, but that also they're seeing it in their countries. So we've been recently contacted by Australia, people in Australia, Canada, Switzerland, UK, and these phenomena are growing because we export a lot of these institutional practices and ideas. So even though people may have socialized medicine in some of these countries, they still are crowdfunding for, the things that aren't covered, like prosthetics or accessibility devices, etc. Travel to and from the hospital. Yeah.
I'm going to stop
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Lauren.
Thanks.
So our last speaker, Andrés Monroy-Hernández, is a lead research scientist at Snap Inc. So that is Snapchat for the people out there that are not savvy to this. But before he was at Snap, he was at Microsoft Research for the 6 years before that, where he arrived at after finishing his PhD at the MIT Media Lab. And so Andreas's work is that he both designs and researches various social computing technologies. He has co-authored a ton with people around this campus, including Mako, including Charlie Keene, Emma Spiro over in the iSchool. He and I were on a panel together a couple years ago about memes, interestingly. So although he has an industry job, he is very active. Oh, he's reading with you too. Okay, Salt as well. And goes to Chi and CSCW and all of these various conferences. So it's very much, like you said, you're on campus all the time, huh?
I am.
So, so I can't wait to hear what you're going to talk about
All right,
today.
awesome.
And with that, let's thank Andrés for coming as well.
All right, thank you. So as Katie mentioned, I'm a lead research scientist at Snap. For those of you who don't know, Snap, in addition to Snapchat, we have a product called Spectacles, which is like these camera glasses that you can use to take snaps. We also own Bitmoji, which is this one. I love my Bitmoji. Unfortunately, I'm not wearing a t-shirt, but I try to match my Bitmoji sometimes. And so the kind of work that I do both at Snap and even before I joined Snap is really focused on designing and studying technologies that enable us to connect and do something bigger than what we can do by ourselves. Sometimes those things are collaborations, which is a lot of the focus that I've been of my research in the past few years, but broadly speaking, it's about connections that we can enable. Some of the things that I do in industry are not just about doing research for the sake of producing new knowledge, although I enjoy that, but also to turn those findings into new products or new opportunities to create new systems that people may use or enjoy, like Gofundme or Facebook or things like that, right? And in particular, in my area, I'm focused in particular in human-computer interaction research. So HCI research, I think, has a lot of overlap with communications, but it's kind of not just about studying what people do, but also about building new tools and new forms of interactions. So just to give you a sense of kind of how I see the field of HCI, which again I think connects a lot with COM, is originally I think when we started with HCI was when one person in front of a computer and we were trying to optimize that interaction. Like how do we make the mice be better at controlling what's happening on the screen? After a while, as we all know, things evolve into computers not just being a solo activity, but being a thing that we use to connect with others. And a lot of literature in the field of HCI for the past few years has focused on that aspect, like how do people use social media, how do people collaborate on Wikipedia, and so on. And I would say like the next wave of what we see today happening in HCI is kind of going beyond this one person, one computer, but really going into kind of computing in the world, computing spread all over. So we see that in terms of ubiquitous computing, where you have maybe Internet of Things devices like the Nest, or wearables like the Apple Watch, phones, all these things that are all over, and really thinking about not just like small groups, but really about crowds of people, like large numbers of people engaging with these technologies. And so I think that also opens up new interesting research questions. In terms of the way I've been seeing HCI research playing out, it kind of goes along these 4 quadrants. And I use this often when thinking about how we do research both in industry and in academia as a good way to think about like when you're looking at a project, where does the project fall? And so on the one axis, it's around methodology. So at least in HCI, there are 2 things that people do. And you see this when you go to conferences in HCI, like CHI or CCW, where you see either people focusing on studying what people do with technology, or focusing on building new technology, designing new technology, right? And sometimes these things overlap, right? Sometimes when you design something, you cannot just say, oh, I built this thing, that's it. You have to say, well, and I show it to people, and people did this with my thing. But it's very different kinds of work. And then in terms of the time horizon, at least in industry, there are 2 types of projects that you see happening. Projects that are focused specifically or driven by a product that already exists. So like if you're a researcher at Google, you may be understanding how people use Google search or things like that. Or you may be part of a team building a new feature, and you are asked to study how people are using this new feature. But even in academia, sometimes people focus on like how do people use Wikipedia, and it's driven by the needs or the kind of what the mission of that particular community may be like. Then there is other kinds of research, which I call curiosity-driven research, which is more about like imagining the world beyond the current products, beyond the current technologies, and either building or designing these kinds of new products, or studying what the world may look like if we kind of take it one step further and say, what are, maybe 10 years from now, what does privacy look like? And you may do studies that try to, investigate that, but really it's looking more at the kind of the future. And that's why I think of time horizon as this other variable there. And so even when you guys think about like students who leave, the comm department and go work at a company, they probably will fall into one of these categories. A typical place for people in the social sciences will fall into study-driven products. Products, people who join a UX research kind of role, but there is a broader range of things that you can do as well. And also when thinking about doing publications, it's useful to know where you position your project. And so for this presentation, I want to focus specifically on design, because it's one of the things that I've been doing lately, and also one of the things that I like the most. And kind of in terms of designing or even doing any kind of work in research and industry, there are kind of 4 ways in which researchers are evaluated. You probably are familiar with the top one, which is the way we are evaluated in academia. But in addition to that, in industry, we think about like how do we create new patents, and that's kind of like the paper equivalent, but in industry, right? So oftentimes the workflow is that you work on a new project, you write a paper, but before you publish it, you publish a patent such that whatever you find is owned by the company. Then the other thing that you can impact, the way in which you can impact the company is through policy. So oftentimes you see this from social scientists who are embedded into companies, who help those companies make decisions about, how do we position this new product, or even how do we think about like ethics and AI, or any sort of things that are more kind of basic, but more kind of fundamental about the policies that the company either decides internally or how they present themselves externally. And this is also what I think people in social sciences are particularly well positioned to play in. And the last one is around products, which is, again, impacting the creation of new products or the study of products. So there's a number of projects that I worked on in the past. I'm going to focus on one of them in particular. And this project is something that we started to investigate about 6 months ago. So one of the things that I often do is that I look at new technologies that are on the verge of being widely adopted, but are not there yet. And I see how those technologies can help us manifest the mission of our organization in new ways. So, for example, when I look at the mission of Snap as a company, we are a company focused on cameras. And so it's a camera company really interested in enabling people to communicate with each other in new and expressive ways. And to kind of help people learn about the world and so on. So I look at sort of that broad mission, and I try to project it into new technologies, again, that are on the verge of being widely adopted. And one of those technologies that we started to explore last summer is wearables. So, today, millions of people have things like Apple Watch or Fitbit and so on, but they're not yet as widely adopted as mobile phones. So part of what we do is we spend a few weeks thinking about what will the world look like 5 years from now, maybe even 2 years from now, when everyone, just like today, has one of these devices. And what kinds of opportunities does that open for creating new potential products, new features, and also understanding how people may interact with each other through these technologies. And so that was the goal of this particular project. We wanted to figure out how to connect people using wearables. And part of it was also a reaction to the way wearables are being used and seen today. Typically today, the image of a wearable is kind of like this, where like you are quantifying yourself. And it's all measuring, like, oh, my Fitbit tells me how much exercise I did today, how many steps, etc. And not so much about self-expression and communication. And so part of what we wanted to do is to think of wearables as devices that are both ubiquitous but individually focused, and taking it beyond being individually focused into more of a social connection opportunity. And that will allow us to do self-expression and communication. And so the thing we started to explore is this project that we call Animo. And we built this very basic kind of form of using the Fitbit Versa. The idea is like, here you have 2 people, Stacy and Mario. They were our interns. And each of them, when they sign up to the system on their Fitbit, gets to pick an avatar. And this avatar, we try to make it as simple as possible. So we have Bitmoji, which is super expressive. You can do all sorts of like cute things. But we try to push it all the way to the simplest form. And so you get to choose either a circle or a diamond. And your circle or your diamond represents you and your mood. And the way we do that is by reading a number of signals from the Fitbit and other places that can tell us how excited you may be, or how chill you are, and so on. And the way we try to represent it is by the motion of this simple figure. And so you've probably seen this experiment that they did in the 60s in psychology, where they had these triangles moving, trying to get into a box. And they use it primarily as an exercise to identify where people fall in the autism spectrum. And people who are not in the spectrum of autism, they just tell you the story of the circles moving, but as figures. People who are not autistic, they will tell you more like, oh, there's these 3 people that were like jumping up and down. And so it was interesting to see, just from that particular experiment that's really old, how people imbue so much information into these basic geometric figures. So that's one reason we chose that. And so again, this avatar type of thing represents you. And you can just be looking at it and that's it. But you can also tap on your watch. And what that does is that it sends your animal, we call the little figure, to the other person that you are connected with. You're allowed to connect to only one person. So this is not like a social network with all your friends. It's really a bond between you and your best friend, your wife, husband, whatever. And so you can tap and send it to the other person. The other person gets a notification, and they can ignore it. We try to make it such that it's ephemeral. We didn't want to make it like yet another feed that you need to check. More like, somebody thought of you, and it's fine, or you can ignore it. But if you do check it, you essentially can see the other person's avatar coming to your watch and performing the little movement that represents how they're feeling. Maybe they're stressed, maybe they're excited, etc. So it's kind of like a mood ring 2.0 kind of thing. And then eventually, once the person sees the animation, it can return back to the other person's watch. So it travels to the other watch. And the idea, again, is to make people have a quick and simple connection with somebody else that doesn't require taking out your phone, unlocking it, opening Snap or SMS, and then typing, hey, how are you? Like really quick, just thinking about you kind of thing. So that was kind of the premise of it. And I can show you a quick video that kind of tells you the story that I just described. I don't know if there's audio. But you can read. Is there audio? This?
Yeah.
Oh, volume. Yeah.
There you go.
Let's hope it's not too loud. Huh. Oh, I think it's coming from the computer itself.
Oh, here.
That's okay, I can narrate it. There's
Oh,
subtitles, yeah.
Sorry.
That's okay. I'll read it. An ephemeral avatar representing your current heart rate. Your animal will change throughout the day based on your heart rate. You can pair your animal with one special person. It's like having them on your wrist. Animal gives a whole new way to stay connected. With a simple tap on your watch, your animal will jump out and visit your friend. Then, when they'll receive it, they'll be able to see it come to life. Then animal will jump back to your watch. You can use animal to have an authentic and light touch connection with that one special person without having to take out your phone. That's the premise of it. And again, one of the things that we were trying to do is leverage the fact that this thing is truly measuring your heart rate as a way to kind of perhaps enabling a opt-in ability to connect with somebody in an authentic way. So like if I take a selfie and I'm smiling and I put like myself like doing something fun, maybe I truly am like really sad or something. So the idea here is that with one person, you may be willing to be vulnerable, and when you feel like it, you could be sharing kind of how you're feeling inside. So we had a number of research questions that we tried to explore. The first one was around how does sharing biosignals on a smartwatch impact communication? Specifically, what kinds of communication does this afford and what patterns emerge? And then the other one is how do people make sense of their own biosignals and develop understanding of each other? So I'll go quickly on the findings, but we ran an experiment with 34 people, 17 couples. Lots of different insights. People use it a lot during the day, primarily when they were kind of busy doing something else, and they were in a meeting, for example. They wouldn't want to take out their phone, but they were like, oh, I'm thinking of my wife, and they will like send something. Yeah. That's a great question. Yeah. So when we onboard them, we told them like this represents your mood and so on. And so we brought the two people at the same time to the lab, and we kind of signed them up. We put them the watch, but we let them to interpret the animal itself. One of the things we did do before releasing this to them is that we use Amazon Mechanical Turk to show Turkers different versions of the animation to see whether everybody agrees or not everybody. Like more than 90% agrees that does represent happiness or represents sadness. But it was totally open to interpretation. And in fact, that was one of the challenges that we found. I think I'll just go straight to some of the things that we found. Is like one of the things we found is that there are kind of two types of people. Some that felt that, well, the Fitbit is accurate and they give me numbers. I should be able to see like happy, sad, or something. And so these people didn't resonate as much with this because they felt like I want accuracy and I expect accuracy from this. There were other kinds of people, which were actually the majority, who felt like the playfulness of it and the abstractness of it was something that they kind of found it to be appealing as a way, kind of the way we read horoscope. Like we know it's not real, but it's kind of fun to read a horoscope and like, oh look, this is amusing. And so you'll get this thing and like, oh, I think I'm happy or stressed, and then you'll send it. And it was really more of an opportunity to establish that connection. One of the things that we heard from some of our participants, and I have it here. So like this person over there is that when they saw each other in the evening, we will like mention what we had sent them during the day. So like I asked if she was in the interviews. In this case, there was a husband and wife, and she was interviewing for a job. And he asked if she was in the interview when she sent it to me. So we talked about that. So it just kind of prompted discussions about our day. So some of these people, because they're very strong ties, they see each other all day. They know, not all day, they see each other every day, but they know exactly what their day is like, so they can interpret. And so that's one of the things that we found. Those people for whom that connected with this very strong tie, like a partner or something like that, they had so much context about that other person's life that it was actually very easy to communicate on a very shallow channel like the one we created. For those who didn't have a lot of context about the other person, this was a very annoying kind of mode of communication, because it was like they wanted to go beyond just that, and they're like, well, what do you mean? Like, so then they will like text or use Snapchat or something. And so kind of the next iteration of this diversity explorer is really focusing on those super strong ties kind of usage rather than trying to focus on like everyone, right? So one of the issues, we were talking about interpretation. One of the issues was around interpretation. And so let me see if I have it here. I'm gonna have it here. Yeah, I don't think I have this quote here, but many people were struggling with how to interpret each other's animals. For the most part, that was part of the playfulness, but for other people were like, well, if I wanted to be abstract, I could just, send some random thing. And so that's something that we're also thinking about the next iteration of this, to like how to enable for less abstract and being more accurate about the sort of identification that we do, and also be more transparent about what kind of signals we can be using, and not just make it like a mood ring, where like a mood ring, you don't really know how it works. You just kind of like, oh, it's kind of fun. But there may be a lot of interesting ways of self-select as a user of this that we may explore in the future. So yeah, I want to maybe open it up for more questions that if people have. Yeah.
I may have missed it. So if are you saying that the little Animo moves quicker if your heart rate's higher, or it moves slower if it's slower?
Yes.
Okay, so
yeah.
it corresponds to you.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And also the color. We try to use both movement and color. Yeah. So like a red Animo that moves fast up and down, maybe that you're mad or like stressed or something like that. Yeah.
But the receiver didn't necessarily know.
They interpreted it that way. So again, we try to, for the most part, make it such that whatever we send was easily interpretable. We didn't want to go to the step of like using emojis, for example, because those are very explicit, like happy, sad kind of thing. And so we wanted to leave that room for open-endedness. So it was like a really tricky space of being like not too explicit, yet trying to make sure that most people interpret it that way. We had, so I can show you here.
It's like a conversation starter.
Yeah, but we did do a little bit more. I don't think I have it here. We had like this emotion circumflex that people in psychology use, where there is like these two axes. On the one axis is activation, or I think they call it arousal. So it could be high or low arousal. And the other one is valence, positive or negative valence. And so we try to create animals that represented all of those quadrants. So high arousal, negative will be like mad or angry. High arousal and positive will be like excited, is happy. Low arousal and positive is like zen and kind of super chill. And so we tried to create animations that represent each of those, and then we tested them with hundreds of people before we shared them with these couples. So to some extent, it was already universal.
Red, fast, slow.
Exactly, yeah. And even the way it moved, like was it a circular movement or like a fast, sharp movement? So we play a lot with that, but still not perfect. It's still like open for more improvements. Yeah.
So what happened? Sorry.
Oh, well, I was sort of wondering, you said it was a 2-week.
2-week study, yeah.
So did people use it more or less as time went on?
Yeah, so actually it was interesting to see even when they used it. So in this plot, so you can see the day that they used it the most, and also the time of the day. So most of those were like working days and work hours. And once we interviewed them at the end of the study, so we did an interview at the beginning, in the middle, and at the end. One of the things that we learned is that it really was primarily useful for them to be in touch with somebody else while they were in a situation where they couldn't feel it was appropriate to take out their phone and so on. So like if I'm right now, like I could send this to my wife and it's like, oh, maybe he's stressed because he's giving a presentation, right? So it will be really rude to take out my phone. I'm like, hey, I'm in a presentation, whatever. So it was like these amulets that people use sometimes, like, people put their name of their significant other and they touch it when they, want to be connected or something like that.
But did they continue to use it at the same rate all the way through?
It varied a lot. For some people, it was like there's novelty effect that, at the beginning, they're trying all things. For a subset of them, they continue using it throughout. This is like steady. Some people, even after the study finished, they continue using it, and they continue, even today, they continue using it, which to me was like, we were just at that point, like, oh, that's okay, we don't have to use it. And they were like, oh, I really like it. So that to me signaled a potential opportunity for, continuing working in this space. Yep.
An operational question. So
Mm-hmm.
if Stacy sends Mario her animal
Mm-hmm.
and he doesn't read it,
Mm-hmm.
he technically can't return it.
It goes back automatically after a certain amount of time. So it expires. Yeah. So like if I send it to my wife, it goes there, and then if she doesn't do anything, eventually it comes back to my watch. We play a lot with that. So like it was anything from 5 to 15 minutes. We try to make it very light touch, so it didn't feel like, oh, I have to be checking it. I don't know if we got it perfectly there, but my hope is that as we do more iterations, we are better at signaling this ephemerality that is like, okay, if you miss it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, a couple of small questions. Does your Animo display on your wearable? Like, so if
Mm-hmm.
if you pressed a button, I'm just thinking about teaching and having students sitting there with their dying heart rates, and the role of negative affect and
Right.
how it plays out. And you had something there about mismatched
Right.
emotions or different forms
Interpretations,
of
yeah.
arousal, right?
Right.
So and it seems like some of those couples who are like, oh, I consent, they seem like they're in the early stages of the
Right.
relationship.
Right.
And I could see this as a vehicle for like negative affect too, right? Like
Right.
passive aggressive.
Yeah.
I'm pissed at you. You haven't done the dishes.
Right. Right.
Here's me mad.
Yeah.
You're hurting my house.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Like I'm downstairs. You're upstairs. There's no emoji that can capture
Right.
like how I'm angry right now.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We did see from the interviews some people mentioning that. I remember there was a couple who said they were going up an elevator to their apartment or something, and they were mad, and that he picked and tried to see what her mood was, just to see if she was actually mad. And then that triggered a conversation between the two of them, like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were mad. So yeah, definitely, it was an interesting. You have to explicitly send it in order to be able to see it. But if you do this movement in a lot of the watches, it automatically detects that you are trying to see it, and so that's what triggers. So like if I'm just like this, you don't see the screen. But if I do this, then the screen gets on.
So how to wait to put on heart rate.
I know, yeah, and that's partly what we are trying to make it playful too, and not make it explicit. Like we truly cannot detect emotions because the only thing we detect is heart rate, and so that's partly why we wanted people to interpret it as they wanted to, because we couldn't be like 100% sure that was correct. And in some way that was kind of the point, not the point. The point was to make it abstract, like a horoscope or a mood ring. Yeah, but I think part of it is like for us to use these opportunities really as a probe to answer all these questions. So one of the things that I enjoy doing with a lot of these projects and partnering with folks like Mako and others here is that a lot of these new products or new technologies are a good probe to answer some basic questions about technology in general, and that can help us, investigate things that are not widely adopted yet. Yeah.
Any other questions?
I'm just curious about your dual identity
Mm-hmm.
and how you navigate that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure there's kind of conflicting moments.
To some extent. I mean, I think the main thing is around publication, probably. Like the value of publications for companies is unclear sometimes. I think depends on the maturity and maybe the seniority of the different people involved and also of the company itself. Publications may be seen as a distraction or as a valuable thing. I think overall, I'm lucky enough that in our team, we really value publications, and it comes from from the executives down. But that's always a challenge, like even in, when I was at Microsoft, I remember Microsoft Research has a long history of existing, but still some people were like, why do we have research? Like, why are we not spending more time like fixing bugs in Word or whatever? It's a valid question, but that's a challenge. And I guess the other one will be more around like short-term versus long-term. And that varies also by the individual and also the kinds of work that you do. So I don't know, that's always something that you're trying to figure out, like, should I be focusing on a feature that we're about to release in our existing product, or think more like blue sky about, this wearable thing that like 10 years from now may be relevant.
It seems like there must be some initiatives where having like peer review and publication and stuff would be a really useful kind of marker,
right,
where others maybe a different metric.
Exactly, yeah. I think a lot of the value that we get in the industry world from academia is around that, like the credibility that you may get from different things. So like this project, for example, is being published in a conference in computer science, which is like the main venue for publications that went through peer review and all these things. So yeah, that definitely provides some value. Yeah. Cool. All right, thank you.